Hello, my name is Terry Clayton, and I'm here to introduce Doug Honig, who is the Director of Communications for the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. Doug has been a director for the educational programming and other outreach program for ACLU for the state of Washington for 27 years. Before that, he was a freelance writer for various publications in Seattle, including doing documentaries for Channel 9 and for the public radio station as well. His background is that he has a Master's of History from Stanford University, and generally good guy. So without further ado, here's Doug.
Thanks. Love coming to Langley. Have been here before, but not recently. My wife used to, before I met her, used to go to Chinook Learning Center, if that rings a bell with anybody, and had an interesting experience. I called saying I was going to be 20 or more minutes late because we had missed the 6:10 ferry, which was the one we wanted to take, and then it turned out it actually was late. So we got here almost on time. And if you followed the controversy in the newspaper at SeaTac over the failure to give Ivers a place among the food vendors, although now I've read that they have a temporary cart, I'm proud to report that in lieu of the wonderful dinner I had promised my wife in Langley, a place to be determined by Yelp, we found that Ivers is alive and well at the Mukilteo Ferry. Yes. A couple of disclaimers. I'm not an attorney. Some of my best friends are attorneys, as they say, but I myself am not, so I can't give you legal advice. I can't help you with your will and whatnot. And the second disclaimer is I'm communications director, so I deal with, as Terry said, with educational programs and the media, and so I know quite a bit about some topics, a little bit about a lot of other topics, but don't claim to know everything there is to know about the ACLU and civil liberties. And the reason I often start with that disclaimer is because people often think that if you work for the ACLU, you know everything that the ACLU does, even though we have branches in all 50 states, and national office in New York, national office in DC. So if there's something you're interested in and I don't know, there's a wonderful resource. It's the ACLU website. If you've ever looked at it, there's just a ton of information there. It's www.aclu.org, makes it easy to remember. And if you want to see what we're doing here in Washington State, it's aclu-wa.org. So those are my two disclaimers. And I'm going to talk about civil liberties under Trump and civil liberties more generally, and what the ACLU is doing here in Washington. But, and my talk is here if you're wondering what I'm going to say. And I like to start, however, on a personal note, and start with my retirement. I was hired by the ACLU in 1990. I thought I had been a freelance writer, and I thought, oh, I'd do this for a year. And in the middle of the interview, the director, who was a good personal friend of mine, said, now, Doug, if we hire you, you're not going to leave after a year. So I quickly calculated and said, oh, no, I guarantee 2 years. And after a while, I realized I'd get vested in the pension program. They actually have one. If I stuck around for 7 years, and being in my late 40s and always having been a freelancer, I thought that would be a smart thing to do. And now I look back and I've been there 27 years, so you never know where life may take you. And been in touch with a lot of issues. I sometimes view the ACLU, working for the ACLU, as being a waiter at a restaurant with a huge menu. And each day you never know what's going to get ordered. There's some things that seem to be there just about all the time. There are other things that have their runs of popularity. There are other things which are popular or come to the fore, and you don't hear of for 10 years, and then suddenly out of the blue, they come back again. The founder of the ACLU back in 1920, Roger Baldwin, had a saying that we like to quote today, which is, "No fight for civil liberties ever stays won." And I'm sure you can, looking at the age range here, I'm sure you all have your own examples of that, and especially in the Trump regime, things that we thought were pretty well, won are coming back. Now, in terms of my retirement, so I've been here 27 years. My wife retired a couple of years ago after a long and very good career as a psychotherapist at Group Health and then on her own. And she's been saying, "Doug, when are you going to retire?" Knowing that I would turn 70 this year, and knowing that some people retire at 65, we have friends and relatives who retired at 55. And so I said, and this would be like last spring and summer, and I'd say, probably a year, maybe a year and a half. Of course, if Donald Trump gets elected, all bets are off. Now, at the time, that was a joke. But of course, the joke's on us. And it's not a joke, and it's not funny. One way to think about it is that it's basically that the Trump presidency basically represents a broad-scale attack on progressive values in general and on a whole wide range of civil liberties issues. But one of the things I'd like to stress is not to get too caught up with Trump the person, Trump the sideshow, Trump the circus. A lot of what's happening in the Trump administration, to the extent that things are happening as opposed to being talked about, a lot of what's happening are things that have been on right-wing wish lists and political goals for a real long time. And I think because of the unique nature and, to many people, personal offensiveness of Donald Trump, that gets lost and much of it gets personalized around him. But if you look at the actual policies, most of them aren't new, certainly in terms of domestic policies. There are things that various sectors of the right have been pushing for quite a long time. What's masked this is the fact that we've had centrists or liberal presidents, or moderate liberal, I should say, for quite a while, and sometimes moderate liberals in control of at least one house in Congress. So things haven't been able to become law that people on the right really wanted to happen. And now with both houses of Congress and the presidency, you're seeing all these things surface. Plus, then you do get the unique feature of Donald Trump that he really has aligned himself with the far right of the Republican Party. Not always, but most often, and especially in terms of civil liberties issues. And of course, the one caveat is, in some regards, there's not a coherent program. It's, as the pundits say, it can be very chaotic, but the other part of not overly personalizing Trump is we don't spend at our office hardly any time talking about Donald Trump. People would think we would, and certainly the National ACLU office in New York would spend more time. But we don't come in each day and say, "Did you see that tweet?" Or "Did you see that picture which appalled my wife and I of him jostling the head of another country out of the way and going in front of them?" All that stuff is fascinating, appalling, interesting, infuriating, but in many cases it's a sideshow. And what we try to focus on at the ACLU is more actual policies or pronouncements that appear to foreshadow actual policies. And the other things that I'll confess, I watch Anderson Cooper or one of the pundits every night for 5 or 10 minutes just to see if something ridiculous has happened that I missed. But I view that more as entertainment, but it's not really what needs to be focused on in the Trump administration. Now, In terms of the actual policies, well, let me back up one more thing. People often ask, what's it like working at the ACLU under Trump? And the answer that I give is days have generally varied from very busy to beyond busy. And that's not a complaint, that's life, but it's just been very, very intense. The good news is it's finally, I hate to say calmed down, but in terms of issues popping for us almost daily, it finally has leveled off a little bit in the past 3 weeks, and we're actually able to do some more long-range planning. It's had a huge impact on the ACLU in terms of, we had thought George Bush was the best recruiter we had ever seen, and that's certainly not the case anymore. And personally and parenthetically, I never thought, and this is not ACLU, this is just Doug speaking, I never thought I would yearn for a time when George Bush was president. But what can you say? And the impact it's had on us has been pretty incredible. Our membership tripled within 3 or 4 months. The more recent figure I've heard from our national office has been quadrupled. We had about between 20 and 25,000, as we say, card-carrying members in the state of Washington before the election, and now it's over 75,000. It's hard to give an exact figure because somebody has to actually tote it up, and that's a lot of work, and it's just hard keeping up with it all. But it's not just membership. We've had just enormous requests of people wanting to volunteer more than we can actually use, which is both a good thing and it's a shame thing. But we have put quite a few volunteers to work. We have an e-activist list, like all the advocacy groups do these days. That means you sign up and you get alerts about once a week, this bill is going to be voted on, and if you want to weigh in, here's how you weigh in, and do it now when it matters. That's now 115,000 people in the state of Washington, which is pretty amazing to me. We also have a lot more financial resources. Not as many as you'd think because of a little quirk. People generally join the ACLU online. And if they join through the ACLU of Washington, we see the money for the first 2 years. If you join through the national ACLU, the national office gets the money for the first couple of years, and the state doesn't. So most people join through the national website because you just think ACLU. So I always like to somewhat debunk the notion that we're just swimming in resources. However, to the extent that we do have more resources, we're certainly putting them to work. The National ACLU is hiring 100 more lawyers. The ACLU of Washington has hired its first ever immigration lawyer. That means somebody who focuses on immigration issues and nothing else. We're hiring somebody to be my deputy, a deputy communications director, hiring another attorney, just here and there. And so that part's exciting because it allows you to do more work. Lest you think that we're getting all the resources we could possibly use, we like to point out that we have 300 and I guess 400 lawyers in the ACLU, and the government has 11,000. And that the ACLU membership is still about half the size of the NRA, and the NRA just has one issue, and we have a very wide range of issues. So we welcome the new resources and support, but we can always use more. And I'd like to say one more thing about membership. If you're not an ACLU member, I'm going to put in a little commercial plug. It's easy to join. You go on the website, $35. If you don't have that, pay whatever, and you're considered a member. The reason it's important to us isn't so much for the financial impact, because that's not really where we get our money is from those $35. It's our ability to influence public policy and elected officials. I was on staff when under George Bush, the membership quickly went from 10,000 to 25,000 in the state of Washington. And believe me, it made a big difference in the willingness of public officials to meet with us, to take seriously what we were saying. And now that it's 75,000, that factor is just a lot greater. And we have a lot of people reaching out to us. They want to know what's the civil liberties angle on this. So we especially like having members because it really increases our clout and ability to both defend and extend civil liberties. Now, when I said that, and the other part is, I think the reason people have joined the ACLU more than anything else is they're looking for organizations that will fight. In other words, people on the progressive side of the spectrum, including I'm sure many, if not all of you, are angry and frustrated and want to do something and want to support organizations that they think are going to do something and just not talk. And the ACLU, since it's been around nearly 100 years and has won a lot of landmark cases, has gotten a reputation for that and for an ability to take on tough issues and not back off because something might be unpopular. Now, when the election was going on, the National ACLU did an analysis of the campaign platforms and pronouncements of all the candidates. That's to get ready. And I should note that we're nonpartisan. We never endorsed candidates, period. We're very happy to speak to the Democrats, to be sponsored, to give an educational talk by the Democrats, but we never endorse candidates, and that's a matter of organizational principle. Also, we never accept government money, period. Can anybody think of one good reason that the latter is the case?
Sure, conflict of interest if you're...
Yeah, who do we sue?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've actually seen instances recently where some of our allies, which are outstanding groups and work with us very hard on a bunch of issues, pulled back at the last moment on a couple of issues because they did get funding from a local government and they didn't want to push too hard lest somebody get alienated. And that's no knock on them, because I totally understand, but we don't want to ever be in that position. So we don't accept government money, period. So we did an analysis of all the programs of the various presidential candidates. When the primaries were over, of course, we threw away all, sorry Bernie supporters, but, and focused on Hillary and Donald Trump. Yeah, expecting that the Hillary dossier would be the one that really mattered. When the election happened, we then threw out the Hillary dossier and focused on Donald Trump and basically looked at what we felt he was likely to do based on what he had said and to the extent that he stood for some things was likely to actually do, and started preparing lawsuits. In other words, started preparing to fight. And so the day after the election, there was an ad in the New York Times where the national ACLU director said, if Donald Trump violates the Constitution, we'll see you in court. And that's basically been our stance. And we filed quite a few legal actions. We have others prepared if the Trump administration actually moves forward on things that we think they will, but haven't thus far. The one that has most come to the fore has been immigration. I think for a couple of reasons. And I hate to put it this way, but it's near and dear to the Trump heart in terms of animus toward immigrants and also in terms of a significant part of the Trump base of support. And it's also something that can be done through executive actions and policies. Now, one thing that's often been said by pundits is that, well, look, he's been president for how many months and he hasn't really passed anything and hasn't really accomplished anything. In terms of legislation, that's absolutely true. In terms of cabinet appointments, that's certainly just the opposite. And in terms of executive actions, he's done quite a bit. And of course, an executive action means you don't need to have anybody's support, you just do it. And so immigration is the area that he's probably moved, that the Trump administration has moved on most. And this is one we were certainly expecting. And the first thing that came to the fore was the Muslim travel ban. Now, I'm talking about this also when I asked Terry, when he invited me to come, what would you like to hear about? That was one of the top things Terry said you want to hear about also. And the Muslim travel ban is basically a ban on people from originally seven nations on entry in the U.S. And there have been many lawsuits. The ACLU has sued over this in Virginia, I think Boston, Washington. There have been numerous other lawsuits, the state of Washington, state of Hawaii, Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, and various other groups have sued this. I look at it as bad policies lead to many lawsuits. And what happened was the courts nearly unanimously sided against the Trump administration. So we came back with another policy, some people call it Ban 2.0, where he took some of the most odious features out of it and shifted from 7 countries to 6 countries. The one that was dumped off the list was Iraq, from the rationale of, my goodness, we're asking those people to fight beside us and get killed in wars that we claim are vital to national security. Maybe people from those countries should be given a little bit of respect. Now, the basic legal issue was that the Trump administration said this isn't a Muslim ban. This is simply a so-called extreme vetting program to make sure we're safe. Now, of course, to the extent anybody has studied it, the conclusion has been that it doesn't make us safer. There are many countries that arguably could be viewed as sources of terrorism which aren't on the list, and that for the most part, analyses of terrorist attacks, if they're not domestic white people doing crimes that should be considered terrorism, but to the extent it's done by people with foreign origins, it's most often people who are here legally already and have been here for quite a while and then get radicalized. And it's not people suddenly entering the country. And also those people who are attempting to enter the country already go through fairly serious vetting as it is. And what we said, the ACLU and others said, this is not a security measure, it's an anti-Muslim measure. And it was something that was very unusual legally, that although I have said, don't get too caught up in the daily tweets, actually Trump's speeches and tweets were used as part of the evidence for why this in fact was a Muslim ban. The countries that were picked were all places with more than 90% of the population practicing Islam. And Trump had repeatedly said he wanted to keep Muslims out of the country. So the argument was to the court, you have to look at the context of the policy and not just the literal words of the policy. And we're very gratified that nearly all the courts that have looked at the issue have said, yeah, that's true, and this clearly is a policy motivated by bias against Muslims, and that violates our Constitution's separation of church and state, the First Amendment. Now, the ACLU of Washington did its own lawsuit that was a little bit different. We represented people that were also affected by the ban who weren't, we felt, well covered or the focus of the other suits. So the suit that we brought focused on refugees and other non-immigrants from those same countries. They say, well, non-immigrant, what do you mean? Well, some of the plaintiffs we had were students at the University of Washington from Iran and other countries. Some people who are covered are people working temporarily, which could be a period of years, for companies, especially tech companies. And the way it affected them is they may want to go abroad relating to their studies. One of the plaintiffs was an Iranian engineering student at UW who had patented an invention and was working with people in China to actually produce this and needed to go and work over there with the people who were supporting his invention. Other people, if anybody, well, you're a historian, you know, conferences are absolutely vital for graduate students, and the concern was if you could leave the country but you couldn't get back in. Or people simply want to visit their families. And the other group of people that we represented in our lawsuit were refugees, because they also were impacted by another part of the ban, which put a freeze on refugees entering the country. Personally, I found this, when you look at it, extremely hypocritical, that a lot of the people supporting this were people who, all through the 90s and the aughts, talked a lot about family values. And it was kind of used, it was a code word and used as a cudgel to beat up on progressives, because you're not really for families. Well, if you look at how these policies work in practice, they're about the most anti-family thing you can imagine. The refugees we represented were people who already had family members here in the United States and were looking to then reunite the family here in the United States, had gone through lengthy vetting abroad to make sure they, as best the American government could tell, weren't a security risk, and were prepared and actually had plans to come to the United States. And then when the ban came, they couldn't get into the country. And this is true for a lot of the immigration policies. What it does is it rips up families. And it's important to always keep that in mind, and that's true for any civil liberties issues. You know, a lot of what we talk about, or when people talk about it, it's in terms of principles. You'll hear the First Amendment, or the principle of separation of church and state, the principle of free speech, your right to a fair trial. So it sounds like abstracts, and on one level, yeah. But the only reason the abstracts matter is because they affect the lives of real people, and sometimes in very dramatic ways. I want to read a couple of, this is from the press release, of just briefly the stories of a couple of the people who were plaintiffs in our lawsuit challenging the refugee portion of the ban. Joseph Doe and you know, Jane Doe and all that. We used a whole series of Does because the people are afraid. Joseph Doe is a Somali national and legal permanent resident who is married and has 3 children whom he has not seen in 3 years. He and his family fled Somalia during its violent civil war to escape persecution and risk of being killed because of the clan they belonged to. While trying to reach safety, they spent weeks in the forest without food, and he witnessed the death of his sister from bleeding. Prior to arriving in the U.S., he lived in refugee camps in Kenya for nearly 22 years. He's seeking to have his family join him here, but their travel was delayed by the Muslim ban. Now, you talk about an anti-family values action. To pick one more, James Doe is an Eritrean national, lawful permanent resident who's seeking to reunite with his wife and children, whom he has not seen in 3 years. He and his family fled their home country after he was imprisoned because of his political beliefs. He had been kept in an underground prison in Eritrea for 5 months. In September of last year, he learned that his wife and children had been approved as refugees and would come to the U.S. within the next few months. Yet the travel is now delayed because of the Muslim ban. So it's, I cite these because I find them rather heartrending, but it's really important just to always keep in mind that they're real people. The other thing I think that's often lost sight of in immigration policy is it doesn't just affect the people and families who are prevented from coming to the United States or who are deported. It really reverberates through communities. When you think about it, immigrants are very much part of a community. They have coworkers. Very often they have kids in school who have friends. They have neighbors. And so when somebody is harmed personally, all the other people are very affected. And we're seeing this very much in schools. We have one staff person who devotes herself to work on something known as the school-to-prison pipeline. And I'll talk about that a little later. And in her work in schools, she's been hearing from teachers and administrators where student bodies are very, very upset because they have a handful of immigrants in their student body who are very afraid of getting deported. But all the other students who still believe in our ideals are very, very upset by this. The idea that a friend could be yanked away for no apparent reason and for having done nothing, and their family may have been here for many years, just doesn't register with the kids. So I like to bring that up because I think it's just always important to keep in mind that how this affects many, many more people. The other thing I find rather hypocritical about the policy is one of our plaintiffs is the Episcopal Diocese of Olympia. They have a refugee resettlement program. Their refugee resettlement program is undertaken as part of their religious values, and it's a sense of their mission of how to bring what they believe in into practice in the world. And many of the people who support the Trump policies are the same people who love to talk about religious freedom and how there's a so-called war on Christmas and how they're not being allowed to discriminate against gay people, and that interferes with their religious views, they claim. Yet there doesn't seem to be any problem with interfering with a church's program based on its morality to help people here in our world. And with anything I say, you're welcome to agree or disagree with it, but that's just a perspective I like to point out. Now, the good news is that the second Muslim ban was also declared unconstitutional by courts and put on hold. The less good news is that the U.S. Supreme Court has agreed to hear it, and hear the appeal of the case. That'll be next year. I don't like to predict in general, and I certainly have no prediction about how that one will come out. The court also allowed a portion of the ban to be lifted, to be enforced. And it's interesting, the portion that the dividing line they used is you can still come to the country from one of the 6 banned nations if you have, quote unquote, a bona fide personal relationship with somebody here in the United States and a family relationship. What does that mean? Well, it's been interpreted by the Trump administration to mean a direct family member, but not grandparents, not grandchildren, not aunts and uncles, or other people who we generally think are fairly close members of a family. That was appealed in court. It was turned down. It was just filed again this week by the state of Hawaii, asking the court to specify what's meant by this bona fide family relationship and to include grandparents. So we'll just have to see how that turns out. Now, I've talked a lot about the ban because that's been probably the most high profile of all the policies enacted by Trump and has had legal action against it. However, it's actually, in terms of the impact on immigrants and the impact on families and communities, it's actually not the most important thing. The most important thing is a change in executive policy for deportation. Now, Donald Trump has said, I want to have a deportation for, this is separate from the wall, which I won't even talk about, but wants to have a deportation force that will get bad people out of the country. Now, under the Obama administration, there were many, many people who were deported, and there was actually a reaction from progressives and immigrant rights groups and the ACLU and others saying that the policy was too harsh. And so in the later years of the Obama administration, the policy was scaled back basically to only deport people who had serious criminal convictions, who, I hate to use this term, but when Donald Trump talks about bad, we're getting rid of bad people, he could arguably make that argument, although you always have to look at what's the actual crime, what's the person, and not use broad brush terms. However, under the Trump administration, it's been greatly changed to anybody who's committed a crime. Well, anybody who is here without documents is here unlawfully. So it basically means all 12 million people who are here undocumented, who may have been here for years, may have families, jobs, be very much contributing members of the community, or may not have been here as long, but certainly have done nothing wrong, have committed no crimes per se, could all be affected. And thus far, the pace of deportations has increased drastically. This is reported by our allies at the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, based in Seattle, which represents people on a one-on-one basis, and they say they're just seeing a big increase in deportations. The numbers haven't been that big lately because Trump administration is in the process of hiring more people to actually do the deportations, and so it remains to be seen to what extent this will be carried out and how great a scope it is. What it does do is create tremendous amount of fear and anxiety in immigrant communities because you just don't know. Because they basically asserted that anybody could be picked up and deported regardless of your status in the community. And there have been instances of people picked up in parking lot outside school, at courthouses, and things like that. It's been rare, but the fact that it happens, people read about it and say, how do I know this won't happen to me? So you've seen a tremendous amount of fear and concern in the immigrant community because of this, and with good reason. Now, one thing that happened recently that we took a leadership role in is the administration. There's an issue of traditionally administration said, oh, we won't pick up people at sensitive areas. Now, what's a sensitive area? It's whatever immigration decides to call a sensitive area. So we contacted the State Bar Association and said, we want you to write a letter to the National Administration saying courthouses should be declared 100% off limit for deportation pickups. And the Washington Bar became the first bar in the country to do that, and we're proud of it. It's still a relatively small thing because there are all sorts of other places where somebody can be picked up. But when people talk about, how do you resist the Trump administration, that's basically what the answer is. You're going to have to find individual situations and multiply them where they are vulnerable and can be resisted. Now, another thing we've done is filed a Freedom of Information Act. It was done by ACLU branches all across the country, including Washington, to the Border Patrol to get documents that they were given from the Trump administration on what's the guidance they've been given about how to implement the Muslim ban. Now, Freedom of Information Act requests are important for a couple of reasons. One, it's a law that holds the government accountable. If they have a policy, we ought to be able to see it. And two, again, if you talk about resistance, it's something that can slow down an administration that's doing things that greatly impact people's rights because they have to respond. Sometimes they respond by not responding, and then you sue. First you file a request and then you can sue. But it is a way of putting them on the spot and forcing them to do something. And the fact that they don't give you the documents usually indicates that there's something they don't want you to see. Way back in the day when I was a freelance writer, there was a whole big issue that I wrote about secret intelligence files by the city of Seattle. They had kept hundreds of them on people who were political activists but who had committed no crime. I always remember doing an article showing the released file, and it was like bad modern art. It was almost all blacked out. And the headline was, "Police show signs of intelligence." But with a situation like that, you just keep after them and keep dragging them back into court. Now, there's some good news about a Freedom of Information request in terms of something else the Trump administration has done that's drawn a lot of attention recently. It's the request by the KUOW Commission. That's the Secretary of State of Kansas, who's been appointed to be co-chair of a Trump administration committee dealing with so-called electoral integrity, and has asked secretaries of state around the country for information, very detailed information about voters. It's based on the premise that there is significant fraud in elections and the national government ought to be able to see this so they can do something. Now, the claim itself is fraudulent. There simply is no proof for it. All the evidence is that electoral fraud is rare and very minor. That's different than other forms of corruption. My relatives are from Philadelphia, and I know about that. But in terms of actual voting fraud, there simply isn't the evidence. So the ACLU filed a lawsuit, Freedom of Information, well, no, they filed a lawsuit under a law I never heard of. It was a Voluntary Commission Act. You know, if there's something, there's probably a law about it. So there's a law for voluntary commissions. And it says that there has to be notice of their meetings, and the meetings have to be public. Well, guess what? The first meeting of the KUOW Commission, there was no public notice, and it was done in secret. So we filed, and then another lawsuit was filed by a group called EPIC, which I think is the Electronic Privacy Information Council. And because of that, the KUOW Commission this week announced that it's suspending its request for information from secretaries of states about people's voting habits and records until this gets sorted out in court. So it's an example, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't view lawsuits as the end-all and be-all, but sometimes they actually are very successful and have real impacts, even against somebody like Donald Trump. So that's a bit of good news. Yeah, and so, but I want to talk about a whole other area of work, and it's not about Trump. When you talk about resistance to Trump, that's very important, but here in Washington, we're a relatively progressive state, and we think, the ACLU of Washington does, that it's important to continue making progress on other issues and not to view ourselves as in foxholes trying to prevent Donald Trump and his administration from doing whatever they are. We think it's important to some extent Washington can be a model for places elsewhere by enacting good laws and by winning lawsuits. One example, people talk a lot about voter suppression, which is what the KUOW Commission is all about, and which KUOW himself has done a lot in Kansas, has been sued numerous times by the ACLU of Kansas. That doesn't happen here in Washington. The reason is it's largely done for partisan purposes, and the party doing it is not in power in Washington. So we actually have been able to extend voting rights in Washington. While much of the country is trying to prevent and fight back against efforts to suppress votes, we've actually extended people's voting rights. It happened in Yakima under the Federal Voting Rights Act. It's a law passed a long time ago that's been partially dismantled, but it still has parts in that are still in force. And in Yakima, you had a situation where you have a sizable and growing Latino population that had never elected a member to the city council because of block voting by the white majority. And the classic example was the city council, or it might have been a school board election, but it was two candidates ran, one Latino, one not Latino. The Anglo candidate decided not to run and announced that, oh, changed my mind, I'm not running for office, don't vote for me. But they made the decision after the ballots had been printed. So her name was still on the ballot, as was Graciela Villanueva. So can you guess who won the election? And that was one bit of evidence that we had. So we brought the lawsuit, it went to court, the judge ruled in our favor that the city had violated the Voting Rights Act, because the Voting Rights Act standard was if a sizable minority has their voting power diluted because of demonstrated block voting, and there's a way to remedy it, then that violates the law, and let's fix it. And the problem was the voting was all at large. So the remedy was to move to a district system. And so they, under the lawsuit we had brought, the judge approved a system of 7 districts. And in the first election in Yakima under the new system, 3 Latinas were elected to the 7-member city council. And then one of them became mayor. So it's very concrete and noticeable change. And now in the next round of elections for this fall, you see several Latina candidates running. And we think that's real significant progress. Now, a lot of times people don't hear about that because it's in central Washington. And the media coverage has been greatly cut back with budget cuts in the media. And so a lot of time, the ACLU of Washington is truly a statewide organization. We're based in Seattle, but as you can imagine, the worst violations of civil liberties aren't in Seattle or King County or probably Langley. And a lot of stuff we do is elsewhere in the state and often gets covered there, but you may not hear about it here. We won another voting rights lawsuit in Pasco. And it's exactly the same issue. The difference was Pasco didn't fight it. Yakima racked up very large legal bills in fighting this, and the law is written such that the prevailing party gets to collect legal fees from the losing party. That's done not to enrich somebody, but because such lawsuits are very complex and time-consuming to bring, and if you didn't have the prospect of recouping your legal fees from a successful fight, not many people would be able to bring these, if at all. So in Pasco, seeing what happened in Yakima, they said, you're right, we're violating the law, let's fix it, and their system has changed also. Also to empower the Latino community in elections. So let me talk about one other thing, then we'll take a break. Washington is a pro-choice state by law. We basically enacted protections of Roe v. Wade by an initiative around 1990. It's called the Reproductive Privacy Act. In doing some research, we found out that actually the Reproductive Privacy Act wasn't being fully implemented in that many local public hospital districts were not providing abortion. The law says that if you provide maternity care as a public hospital district, you have to provide substantially equivalent abortion services. Yet the hospitals were referring out. They're saying, oh yes, we're pro-choice. You can get an abortion. Let us tell you where you can go to get one. Now, in some places, that may not be that big a deal. In a place like Jefferson County up in Port Townsend, which was a place we went after, if you can't get it in Jefferson County, you're going to have to go a goodly distance. And that's true for many places in the state. So we sued Skagit County, who said, oh, but we're so pro-choice. Why are you suing us? We're referring people to Planned Parenthood. Isn't that great? And we said, yes, that's very nice, but you should be providing it to under the law. That's what the law says, comply with the law. And so it was a lawsuit. We were very gratified that the court agreed with us. And we're hopeful that very soon they'll be providing abortions to people who choose on site in Skagit County. Now with Jefferson County, we wrote letters to several other counties pointing out the law, not suing them, although when people get letters from us that have a lot of legal citations, they often get nervous about what this might mean. And so we wrote a letter to Jefferson County, and much to their credit, they formed a study group. They said, what's up with this? Let's look at it. And then many people locally turned out to council hearings saying, I think the ACLU has a good point. We should be complying with this law, and we should provide abortions here. Why should people have to go dozens of miles when the law says they ought to be able to get it here? So they formed a study group and came back with a recommendation that they're implementing, that they're going to be providing abortions in Jefferson County. And it gets into a major reason that we file lawsuits. Although it always helps individuals, it's more to set precedents or to influence government bodies. So if you win it in one jurisdiction, I'm the communications director, so part of my job is to publicize all this and make sure other people hear about it, and also that public officials are aware that if they're on the losing end of clinging to a policy that interferes with people's rights, they're going to hear about it, and they might read about themselves in the newspaper. And if instead they meet with us quietly and agree to do the right thing in terms of respecting people's rights, they may not ever see anything about it in the newspaper. So let's take a little break, and then I'll be glad to answer questions, and if you don't have questions, there's plenty of other things I can talk about.
So Doug, really appreciate you going into some detail about some of the things happening statewide and nationally. Could you tell us, is there something on the horizon now, an issue that, we're all watching the news, whether it's CNN or PBS or whatever it is. What's coming up that you predict pretty soon, whether it be a firestorm or just kind of something that's generally coming in with the time that ACLU is paying attention to and that might behoove us to pay attention to?
Yeah, and this might not be immediate, but it's definitely on the horizons. Who's heard of the Arlene Flowers case? Does that ring a bell to anybody? Thanks. Well, my spouse has. Okay, you probably have heard of it without the name of the case. It's something that we call religious refusals. It's the notion that if you're a business person, you get to opt out of anti-discrimination laws if serving somebody violates your religious principles as you, as a business owner. There have been several cases of this around the country. There was one in Tri-Cities where it was a gay couple, Rob and Kurt, were going to get married. They had been in the community for a while, and they were looking forward to a wedding with maybe 100 people. They had a florist they had used for many years, and when they went to, and she knew they were gay, so that wasn't an issue for her per se, but when they went to ask for flowers for their wedding, she said, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. This would go against my religious beliefs to support a gay wedding. And we represented them in a lawsuit, and separately the state attorney general, Bob Ferguson, filed a lawsuit, and the argument was that it violated state anti-discrimination laws because if you're a business open to the public, you have to serve everybody equally, and you don't get to pick and choose based on their religion. For example, well, gee, I think all Muslims are terrorists, I wouldn't want to give flowers to a Muslim. You can come up with your own examples of that, and they said it was a matter of freedom of expression because the floral arrangement was, would be very artistic, and of course this interferes. This is for speech, and it also violates religious rights. And in one sense, it is a clash of rights. But if somebody can opt out of anti-discrimination laws based on citing their religious views, it sort of opens a real Pandora's box and undermines anti-discrimination laws, because it's sort of endless, the number of religions and reasons people could come up. So we won at the lower court level, and then the Washington Supreme Court agreed that this violated, didn't accept the freedom of expression, artistic floral arrangement argument, and did say that this was important. And it was very gratifying to hear some of the questions with one of the justices who's African American saying, what would this, I've lived through times of when discrimination was part of the law, what would this mean if a hotel keeper decided, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what's happened recently, when you say something that's in the news, there's a similar case in Colorado. It's a bakery case. It's a wedding cake instead of flowers, and the courts have ruled in favor of the gay couple, and the U.S. Supreme Court just recently agreed to hear an appeal of that. And although I say I don't predict, they didn't have to hear the appeal. That still doesn't predict how the ruling will turn out, but it's one to watch. And yeah.
Oh, no, I'm just doing a follow-up question is, given the current Supreme Court, should we be trying to steer cases away from them? Or?
Well, that's an interesting issue. Yeah, actually, ACLU and other groups do things very strategically.
Right.
This is something I always like to point out, because typically when you hear about what we do, it's always in the newspaper when we've sued, and you think, my goodness, I don't agree with that. Don't they realize, didn't they think about? And the answer is, of course we did. You know, there's very lengthy discussions before we do anything. Sometimes you wonder, how do we get anything done? But it's more a matter of just being very diligent and being very strategic. So one of the considerations is, where do you sue? And Washington is fortunate that we have a very strong constitution in terms of protections for privacy, protections for separation of religion and government, protections for freedom of speech. So I think increasingly you'll see more cases brought in state court when you have state constitution claims you can make. So absolutely, that does become an issue. And with the Arlene's Flowers case, the florist is represented by a national right-wing legal foundation with substantial resources. So they have announced that they're going to file a petition probably next week to ask the U.S. Supreme Court to hear the Arlene Flowers case. So that's one you will hear in the news one way or the other, I would expect. And the court may not take it up because they may say, hey, we're already doing the bakery case. Just put this one on hold, and whatever we decide for the bakery case would apply the same. Or in theory, they could do some sort of consolidation, so we'll see. The other feature of that, we've been very concerned that the administration will issue an executive order on so-called religious freedom, defining religious freedom as the ability of a business owner not to serve anybody if they believe that it interferes with their religious viewpoints. In other words, not even waiting for the court, but doing it through executive order. That would trigger legal action by us, but that's one we're concerned about. There and then there. Or you and then you.
This is really short. I just wanted to let you know that because of the uproar, when Peace Health tried to merge with Whidbey General and Island Hospital, both of them said no. And so that was a victory for all the people that really spoke out against those mergers.
Yeah, that was great.
I just wanted to let you know.
No, I appreciate that, and people, I've had many people say, what can I do? You know, I'm appalled by a lot of stuff the Trump administration is doing, what can I do about it? That's one example. It's like, look at what's a local issue. I mean, I sign petitions to Donald Trump and do all that kind of stuff, but, you know, really. But getting involved in a good local issue, and I know there's been a whole issue here over Sanctuary City, and our immigration lawyer that we hired actually wrote a lengthy memo that we provided to some of the organizers refuting the local government's officials' reason for not wanting to support this. But unfortunately, it hasn't been one yet.
When you mentioned about executive decisions,
Executive orders?
Yeah.
Executive orders, I mean, what is the limit on executive orders? I mean,
It's what the court will limit. In other words, Obama used executive orders a lot, and Trump is doing even many more. And it really is case by case. If an executive order can be viewed as violating a law or the Constitution, it can be sued and stopped or rolled back. But there's no, numerical limit. It's not like you get to do 99 of these in a year and you've used up your quota. It also gets into something you hear talked about a lot, which is nature of a democratic society. And it's one reason the ACLU is nonpartisan, because we've seen abuses of power by people in both parties. At the national level, you know, that phrase about power corrupts, and there's a tendency for people in situations of power sometimes to want to use that power. And we all tend to approve of it when the power is used for causes we approve of. But this is just something to think about. If this were something being done by somebody of another party, would you react differently? And I want to give an example. It has to do with the KUOW Commission. The ACLU thinks that our Republican Secretary of State has handled it well, in that she says our state's public disclosure law grants access to a few of the things which KUOW wants, and here's a link to that. You can request it, and there's nothing that she can do to prevent that. But any of the other stuff not guaranteed by law, she's not going to provide. Now, some people have been critical, saying, oh, she should just take a stance, nothing, even though they're going to get it anyway because that's what the law is. Something to think about. If you look at what the principle would be, we have a Public Disclosure Act as a way of holding government accountable, and it basically allows anybody, including anybody here in this room, to request any government document. And in general, that's a pretty good thing. Obviously, it can be abused, and it can be done for reasons you might not approve of. But if you want to say, government officials should turn down public disclosure requests if they think they're going to be used for purposes which the government official doesn't approve of, that's a real can of worms. When you think of prison rights activists, do you think the prison administration would ever approve, if that were the standard, would ever approve of them getting documents and raising heck over the prison administration trying to deal with what they view are very, very difficult issues? And so it's just something to think about. But other questions?
Thanks for coming tonight.
Yeah.
I took care of writing this down, so I hope you don't mind if I read my question. Many of us, including me, take our Fourth Amendment rights very seriously. And the post-9/11 era and the Trump period in general have brought some ominous challenges to the Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. Just one briefly, the flagrant abuses of civil rights by the Border Patrol that took place over on the Olympic Peninsula, which I'm sure you're aware of. And the ACLU has an excellent description of a 100-mile constitution-free zone, which I'm not going to talk about.
Yeah.
I know this is a complicated issue, but would you discuss probable cause, the so-called Terry stop, and the different standards that various law enforcement agencies, federal and local, use to justify warrantless searches?
I can describe some of that, but not being a lawyer, I'm going to not try to describe a Terry stop.
Could you repeat it, because
Well,
we couldn't hear what you
No,
said?
it's basically the Fourth Amendment is a very, very important right, and it's coming under fire, especially these days. And one context that was brought up was the U.S. Border Patrol and the Constitution-free zone. Let me talk about that. When you think about, because the question asked me to talk about it, and I like talking about it. When you think about the border, everybody might have a different notion of how far from the border officials' powers should run. And you might think, well, just at the border, or maybe 1,000 feet. Or you could, well, let's be generous, 5 miles, or maybe 10 miles. You could think of somebody making a mad dash in their car or something. Well, the Border Patrol, the federal agency, asserts that their jurisdiction is 100 miles from the border. If you go back to middle school, when you do those maps of the U.S. and start filling in the colors for all sorts of purposes, that's a lot of the country. And so the ACLU, immigrant rights activists, and others have been very active in trying to keep reins on the Border Patrol. We actually sued successfully over a practice in Washington State of local police holding people, say they stop somebody for a traffic stop, holding them if they appear to be an immigrant, which is known as profiling. How do you know? Well, it's by the way they talk, the way they appear, your guess on this, which may be accurate or not. But that's classic example of profiling, and they would call in the Border Patrol, who then would do a check on their immigration status and potentially put them in deportation proceedings. It's related to the sanctuary city issue, except this is out on the highways and not in a city. So we want a court ruling along with the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project saying that's a violation of rights. Another one we want a settlement of was also profiling on the Olympic Peninsula by the Border Patrol, where we got a lot of reports that people were being stopped by Border Patrol agents, not because they had done anything wrong, but based on their skin color and perception that maybe they were Latino, meaning maybe they were not here legally. And so we filed a lawsuit over that. Interestingly enough, the people who were plaintiffs in the lawsuit were U.S. citizens who were African American who lived on the peninsula, and two of them worked in correctional agencies. But, you know, if you're being stopped because of the way you look, they have no idea who you are. And we want a settlement on that one too, and the Border Patrol has said they wouldn't do it. We actually occasionally have met with Border Patrol officials to press them on search and seizure issues and the kind of thing you're talking about. And you know that phrase, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. That's really true when it comes to Fourth Amendment search and seizure. Because law enforcement agencies, if you put yourself in their shoes, they're always going to try to push the envelope on when they can search and whatnot. I'd like to talk about one of my favorite victories, because we're friends with the guy who wrote the brief. He was employee number 50 of Microsoft. So when I was talking about my possible retirement at 71 or something, how old was he? 33, 35, having led the team that did Excel. Retired 35, and he is a devotee of privacy and especially search and seizure. And he's really devoted himself to becoming an expert. And he started volunteering in our office, pro bono, and then realized when he was about 40 that, gosh, if he went back to law school and got a law degree, he could file lawsuits. And wouldn't this be even better? So he did, and one of the first ones he did had to deal with GPS. And it was an interesting one. It was late 90s when GPS first came into being. Now, I'm not going to talk about how Siri gave us bad advice today and told us that all the side roads that had an infinite number of very short lights were just as good as I-5. And Tricia sitting down front kept going back to Siri. I kept saying, this is nonsense. And she said, well, let me check. No, Siri still says, this is better. So what it was is police, I think in Spokane, suspected somebody of a crime and wanted to check them out, and attached surreptitiously, of course, a GPS device to their car. Now, they didn't get a warrant. This became a landmark case. Their argument was, as a police officer, I can follow you down the street in my car. I don't have to get a warrant for that. I can follow you for a period of blocks. This isn't any different. Our ex-Microsoft friend said, no, this is a lot different. This is like having a police officer in your back seat 24/7. And very fortunately, the court sided with our argument and said, yeah, this is remarkably different and it violates your right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. Doesn't mean that the government can't do that, but they have to get a warrant. Now, I should add, and then other courts have said the same thing, and that's a fairly accepted principle now. I should add another thing about warrants. Back in the immigration context, when we talk about sanctuary cities, it's not a legal term, as you may know. It's a vague term that sounds good and is used for a variety of policies that all have the same concept of local government not cooperating with federal deportation efforts unless required by law. So in other words, if there's a warrant out for somebody based on them having committed a serious crime and the Border Patrol or ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is looking to pick up this person based on a warrant signed by a judge, then law enforcement locally would cooperate with that. So it's not flouting the law, but the situation that was most common was people who were in jail for lesser crimes and were scheduled to be released after serving their time, and the federal ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, had what they called a detainer request, could you hang on to this person for a couple more days so we can check out their immigration status and potentially deport them. And local law enforcement in many, many jurisdictions here have rejected that, saying it's not our requirement. You know, first of all, it's not our mission to engage in federal immigration enforcement, although we'll cooperate if you have an actual warrant. And it actually undermines community trust if immigrants are afraid to come forward and cooperate with us because of the way we treat them in discretionary situations like this. And it's bad for our public safety mission. And this is an instance where law enforcement has generally taken a very enlightened, at least in this state, enlightened approach. One thing that ICE has said is, oh, we have warrants. So you have to deconstruct the word warrant. What they're talking about is not a warrant signed by a judge based on probable cause that somebody is committing a crime, but rather it's an administrative warrant signed by an ICE, by ICE. But they attach the word warrant to it. Now, local law enforcement has been very good to say, no, we know what a warrant is. This is not a warrant. Get us an actual warrant. Go before a judge. Now, you asked the question, what's probable cause? Ultimately, in a case, it would be up to what a judge will agree. It's a lot of legal terms ultimately come down to a reasonable person. There's stuff that's spelled out in law. Many of our laws are fairly detailed, but have been interpreted down through the years by courts, which becomes known as case law and has the force of law. So it's in all sorts of situations. Is this a reasonable reason to have a search? Other questions? Yeah.
I just wanted to mention a prominent case that's coming up with ACLU's suing in Spokane. They're the two guys that came up with the model for torture for the U.S., Justin and Mitchell, are being sued by ACLU. Big deal. This is going to be an international deal.
Yeah.
It's the only time that those who came up with the torture protocol are going to be public accountable. So I want to thank you for that. I do have a question on
Let me add, there's going to actually be a 2-week trial on that in Spokane right after Labor Day. And of the two psychologists who devised and then helped implement the torture program, the ACLU is representing some of the people who were actually tortured under this.
And I'm going to be there if you're interested to follow that up. My question is, what is the relationship between the lawsuits that ACLU does and actually legislative advocacy for laws that follow?
Integrated advocacy. If you were to get hired for my job after I retire and got to go to a national ACLU conference, of course, with any professional organization, you hear buzzwords, right? And we're not immune from that. So one that's been big in the last few years is integrated advocacy. And what that means is when any issue comes up, take the Muslim ban. Somebody brings it up, so we have a staff meeting and we look at it. Is this an issue that violates civil liberties? Is this an issue that violates it in an important enough way that we should do something? If so, what should we do about it? And there's several different things we can do. One of them is file a lawsuit. Another one is write a legal letter, but don't actually sue. In other words, you write to the government entity, hey, did you realize you're violating the law? Here's all the reasons. That can be more or less legalistic, depending. Another thing you can do is attempt to pass a law. You can go to the legislature, or you can go to your city or county government. Another thing you can do is just talk about it in the media. In other words, try to bring attention to it, put them on the spot, perhaps embarrass them. Another thing you can do is rally people to write letters to the government official, have a rally in the street, go to meetings, have forums like this. And so any issue that comes up, we look at all of those options and decide which makes the most sense. Sometimes it's one. Sometimes we both sue and bring a bill in the legislature. And sometimes we do three of them. Sometimes we do none. We decide, yeah, we don't like this, but it's not that big a deal. Or, yeah, we don't like this, but the law is very well settled on this, and there's no reason for us to do anything about it because we're going to lose. And we'll have to fight this at some point in the future. Then we'll get over this.
Could you speak to the Electoral College and if it ever made any sense, and if we need to change the Constitution, and if there's any safe way to change the Constitution, if you call a constitutional convention, you're kind of unleashing Pandora's box.
Yeah. Basic answers are no and yes. No, it doesn't make, in modern times, it doesn't make sense. Yes, the ACLU believes it should be gotten rid of. You're absolutely right. A constitutional convention would be a really big problem because once you have this, anybody could propose anything, and God or goddess or whoever you pray or don't pray to knows what would happen. So we would not be in favor of a constitutional convention unless it was very, very narrow. You can go to the states, and I think if you get 3/4 of the states to adopt something, state legislatures to adopt something, that's how you can amend the Constitution. But it's more a matter of political will. I think a lot of people would agree with you that it doesn't make much sense, but that's different. And the problem is the smaller states that are, disproportionately advantaged by it, so it just makes it hard to change. But yeah, it's an important issue, and we're in favor of abolishing it, but we're not necessarily leading that. Right.
Yeah, a couple months ago, President Erdogan was in Washington, D.C. meeting with Trump, and his bodyguards beat up a bunch of demonstrators. He was in from the film clip I saw, he was in no immediate danger of any kind. And so my question to you is, what was the government's response and what should it have been?
That's a good question, and that's a tough one, since it's not U.S. law enforcement acting on it. I'll say I personally haven't followed that real carefully. I've seen headlines on it and thought it was appalling, but I haven't thought about it a whole lot. You'd think that, off the top of my head, you'd think that in general, if it's happening in this country, even if it's a foreign dignitary, our own law enforcement, with our own standards of what's appropriate, should be taking the lead, rather than law enforcement from another country that may have much different standards. After the fact, what can be done about it is a really good question, and I'm actually not sure. Did you have a thought on that?
Well, I was appalled that there wasn't more outcry about it. It was just stunning to me to see that happen, and nothing happened. I guess there's, his bodyguards are not going to be allowed back in the country. But, geez, to beat up those demonstrators like that was just appalling.
Well, when you talk about life under Trump, there are so many things going on that different people find outrageous. Some stuff that might have been called out as a bigger deal in previous years, depending on what else is going on, may get preempted by something new hitting the fan. And with the, and that's not a justification. I'm just saying I see a lot of that, and especially with all the revelations about Russian interference in the election, some of the other issues that might have gotten more attention tend to get edged out, and that can be a real shame.
Are you seeing more state legislature, not only Washington State, but across the country, bringing forth legislation to criminalize resistance and peaceful protest?
Yeah. Bringing forth legislation is different than passing legislation, but yeah, absolutely. Now, there was one that we had here in Washington by one of Donald Trump's campaign co-chairs that was aimed at environmental protesters, that created that he said it was a form of terrorism, people who would sit down on railway tracks and do civil disobedience. So he referred to it as economic terrorism. His name was Doug Erickson, and proposed a law that anybody who did this would face very heavy charges, and he defined a whole bunch of things. I was glad that I was able to, in my job, speak out about it. You know, I got calls from the media. Well, to give you an idea how stuff comes down, it was 5 of 5 one day, and I got an email from somebody in the Seattle Times. My initial reaction was, really?
Doug, excuse me, does everybody know who Doug Erickson is?
Why don't you
He's
explain
a
it?
Republican from Ferndale,
Yeah.
and he has a huge impact on the Republican Party here in the state of Washington. And here's kind of what Doug has been mentioning earlier. You know, if it happens in Yakima or Pasco, we really don't get wind of it here. Well, there's a classic example of something that's 90 miles away and could have huge impact on people's rights to protest peacefully, but may not be covered well, even if it's covered in the media. It's kind of back in section B, page 7 at the bottom.
That was inflammatory. You're absolutely right. Fortunately, that was viewed as inflammatory enough that it did get covered. And actually, I decided to stay late and call my boss before she had gone home. And so what I said was, what he's talking about, you know, that people in the civil rights movement interfered with business. They sat down at lunch counters, broke the law, and interfered with business. We don't consider them terrorists. We consider them national heroes today. And he was roundly criticized. I mean, obviously some people agreed with him, but in general he was roundly criticized. And you get into the political dynamics, and the Democrats generally criticized him, and the Republicans saw this as, this is not a fight we want or need. So he proposed the law, but it didn't really go anyplace, which was gratifying. But, you know, in answer to your question, yeah, we're seeing more like this. Way in the back.
How come
Actually,
it's
Jane
your,
had
it was
had
your
that for a long
turn.
time.
She had her hand up.
That's okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Call on the girl.
I'll call on whoever wants to speak.
Okay, I have a question about the reproductive rights, and I think Island County Hospital, or our hospital right here, was involved in that as well, and the ACLU did contact them. I don't know if they had an actual suit with them. But I asked one of the commissioners, you know, why, because I found out personally from someone that you can't get an abortion at our hospital at the time. And so I asked one of the commissioners about that, and she said, well, you can't ask a doctor if they, when you're hiring them, if they will perform abortions. Is that true?
That's a good question. We have a staff person, we have a whole bunch of special projects, and one of our projects is religious takeovers of secular hospitals. I mean, we have a staff person who does nothing but that. I don't know the answer to that, so I will ask her and email Terry and find out, because that's a good question. In general, when we first bring this up, like when we talked about how we had success in Skagit and Jefferson counties on this, the initial reaction would be, oh, of course we agree with you, of course we're pro-choice. Oh, but we don't have doctors who can do it, or blah, blah, blah. And our answer is, find some. It's like, this is the law, you comply with the law, there are ways it can be done, you can work with UW Medical School, they can help you trainings, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a good question, let me see if I can find out. Trish, you know the answer?
I don't know the answer, but it just seems that even if you can't ask directly, you can certainly put that in your job description. That part of the duties, we're going to be expected to perform abortions according to state and federal law, blah, blah, blah. And they could be quiet and raise a ruckus later, but it seems less likely. If that's explicitly stated, you don't have to ask them, you just tell them.
Right, I would guess that's the answer, yeah.
It's great having you here tonight. We have you here because we appreciate your advocacy and you align with issues we're concerned about. I guess I'm wondering, who's the anti-ACLU in Washington State? And who are the organizations that counter you in court, and who funds them?
It depends on the issue. You have the Evergreen Freedom Foundation in Olympia, sometimes it's on opposite issues. On issues involving religion and gay rights, Washington Family Policy Council, FPIC. You have various anti-immigrant organizations that just focus on that. There's one, Respect Washington. I wouldn't say there's a single organization, it's a variety of organizations. And the other thing is, in addition to being nonpartisan, we work with people across the political spectrum, and we actually work with people on selected issues who normally we are against. And we do this in part by trying not to demonize individuals or organizations. There are exceptions, but in general, we try to be respectful toward opponents. Like I like saying, if you're against us 80% of the time, that means you're with us 20% of the time, and let's not burn all the bridges that we can't work with you. One interesting example is we're against the death penalty, and we are working hard to get it repealed in Washington. In order to do that, you can't just have support from liberals. So one of the strongest sources of support is the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is also one of the strongest opponents of ours on some reproductive freedom issues. So we're very careful when we're on the opposite side of the Catholic Church, never to say anything demeaning them or questioning their integrity, but to just talk about the issue. We've also found that right-wing Tea Party Republicans are very much with us, more so than some liberal Democrats, on one range of issues. Can anybody guess what range of issues that is?
Criminal justice. Property rights.
Government surveillance. If you don't trust the government. Now, there was an interesting thing about how that could be applied to the death penalty. When you think of right-wing Republicans, you generally think people who are very much law and order and very suspicious of the government, especially the Tea Party branch. Well, if you feel that way, the argument goes, shouldn't you be against the death penalty? If you don't trust the government to deal with your property fairly and to deal with your taxation fairly, why would you trust the government to fairly make a decision of life or death? And so we're always looking for ways. Now, somebody meant, to reach people who you wouldn't expect to be normal allies, but on a given issue, we may align. Now, somebody said criminal justice reform. That also is true. And I should say that that's the biggest issue the ACLU has been working on prior to the Trump administration's unexpected ascension. And it continues to be a major, major issue. And when I talked about making gains here in Washington, even while there's many things we're having to defend, criminal justice reform is the biggest one, and it has to do with one of these terrible abstract words, mass incarceration, or over-incarceration. It means a lot of people locked up in jail, or as some people say, locked up in cages. And there's increasing support from Republicans on this issue because it's seen as inefficient and simply spending too much government resources. And you have some of the most right-wing Republicans, if you've read about the Koch brothers, who are the bête noire of liberals in many ways, and they're in favor of some criminal justice reform because they see it's simply bad government. And we are willing to work with them on that issue, even though we might disagree with them on a lot of other issues like voting rights. Before I forget, on the table just by the door, I did bring 3 freebies. One is my favorite post-election bumper sticker that we've come up with. No one trumps the Constitution. Feel free. But if you take it, actually use it. Second one is we created Bill of Rights, little pocket-sized, except it's in plain language. We were doing this as a project like, yeah, let's hand out the Bill of Rights. With Trump in the White House, people really want to see this because he throws around terms like so-called judges. Or, you know, this was a judge in Hawaii, as if that's not part of the United States. And somebody said, yeah, but the language is so archaic. When people actually read it, it sounds weird. So we found online and modified Bill of Rights in simple language. So feel free, and then also join the ACLU if you're not a member, or if you have a friend or relative who you think, how come they're not an ACLU member? It's cheap and it's a good thing to do.
Repeat the website for the ACLU?
Yes.
So everybody gets it?
www.aclu-wa.org.
Doug, I want to thank you for coming and speaking.